Welcome to episode 69 of Gods and Heroes of Ancient Greece. My name is MyLinda, Butterworth, and today we continue with the tales of Troy and the story of Paris Returns. Although the Trojans did not know that a great fleet had already reached their shores, the city had been in a turmoil ever since the Argive envoys had departed, for everyone feared wars. Paris, the while, had returned with his beautiful prize and the ships with which he had set out. King Priam was ill pleased with this unwelcomed daughter-in-law, and at once summoned his numerous sons to a council of princes. But they were quickly beguiled by the gleam of the treasures their brother was so ready to share with them, and by the loveliness of the maidens Helen had brought in her train. These Paris was very willing to give in marriage to those who were still unwed. Besides, most of the brothers were young and all of them eager to fight, so the upshot of the discussion was that the stranger was to be taken into the palace and not handed over to the Achaeans. Matters were quite different among the common people. Fearing a siege of their city, they had not hailed the arrival of the prince and the fair woman he had carried off. Many a curse had speeded him on his way, and here and there even a stone was cast as he conducted his stolen bride to his father. But reverence for the old king and reluctance to cross his will restrained the Trojans from opposing this new resident of the palace more resolutely. Now that the council called by Priam had decided not to drive Helen from the land, the king sent Hecuba to her by the women's chamber in order to convince himself that the wife of Menelaus had really come to Troy of her own free will. Helen declared that her ancestry made her just as much kin to the Trojans as did the Danai, for Danas and Agnar were her own forebears as well as those of the Trojan royal line, that she had indeed been carried off against her will, but that having belonged to Paris for so long a time, she now loved this new husband of hers and wished to remain with him. Furthermore, she said, she could hardly expect either her first husband or her people to pardon her, so that nothing but disgrace and death were in store for her should they yield her up to the Argives. As she spoke, her face was bathed in tears, and she threw herself at Hecuba's feet. The queen raised her tenderly and told her that the king and his sons had resolved to protect her from any attack that might threaten. The Argives before Troy. For a while, Helen lived at her ease at the court of the king of Troy, then moved with Paris to a palace of her own. The people grew to admire her loveliness and beauty, and when the alien fleet actually was sighted off the coast of Troy, the citizens were less intimidated than when they had feared some vague peril to come. The leaders took stock of the inhabitants and of the allies who had promised to come to their aid, and found that in numbers and equipment they equaled the Argives. And so, with the help of the immortals, for besides Aphrodite, several of the other gods, among them Ares, the war god, Apollo, and even Zeus, the father of the gods, were on their side, and they hoped to withstand the siege of their city and force the enemy to retreat after not too long a time. King Priam himself was too old to fight, but he had 50 splendid sons of all ages, of whom Hecuba had borne him 19, some in the flower of youth, some at the peak of their strength, before all Hector, then Deiphobus, and the most distinguished after these, Helenus the soothsayer, Palmon, Politus, Antiphus, Hipponus, and handsome Troilus, 4 lovely daughters gathered around his throne: Cretia, Laodice, Cassandra, and Polyxena, who even in her early childhood had been surpassingly beautiful. Chief of the host now preparing the war was Hector, tall in his crested helmet. Next in power was Aeneas, King Priam's son-in-law, Croesus' husband, a son of Aphrodite, and Anchises, the aged hero, who still the pride of the Trojans. Another battalion was led by Pandarus, son of Lycaon, whose bow had been given him by Apollo himself. Other battalions, some of which were made up of the allies of Troy, were headed by Adrastus, Amphius, Asius, Hippothus, Pylius, Alcamus, Euphemius, Pyrecames, Pylamenes, Hodius, Ephistrophius, Chromius, and Ennumus were the leaders of the auxiliaries from Mysia. Phorcys and Ansius of similar forces from Phrygia, Mesthles and Antipas of Meonians, Nace and Amphimachus of Carians, and Sarpedon and Glaucus of a Lycian army. In the meantime, the Argives had landed and settled along the shore between the two promontories of Sigium and Rhetium. Their camp was so vast that it looked not unlike an entire city. They had beached their ships and placed them in rows, one behind the other. And since the ground sloped up from the coast, the vessels stood in tiers, the sections of the fleet belonging to the various peoples who had joined in the expedition were arranged in the order in which they had landed. Each vessel was set on a base of stones, lest the keel rot from the moisture in the ground. In this way, the air could pass around and beneath them. In the first row, seen from the land, were the ships of Ajax and Achilles. Both had built their huts facing Troy. That of Achilles was more like a comfortable house. Attached to it were barns and stables for supplies, chariot horses and cattle, and besides his ship there was room for races, burial rites and games and other festivities. Now, next to the ship Ajax came to Protestilaus, then those of Thessalonians, and then of the Cretans, the Athenians, the Phoenicians, the Boeotians, and last in the first row were those of Achilles and the Myrmidons. In the second row there were the Locrians, among others the Doletians and the Epians. In the third were the ships of less well-known people, but also those of Nestor, with the Pylians, Eurypylus with the Armenians, and finally Menelaus. In the fourth and last row along the coast and nearest the sea were Diomedes, Odysseus, Agamemnon, Odysseus in the middle, and Agamemnon to the right, and Diomedes to the left. Before the house of Odysseus was the agora, the open place where assemblies and councils were to be held, and where altars had been reared to the gods. The open place ran through the third row also, and divided it so that Nestor was to the right, and Eurypylus to the left. Toward the sea there was much less space to begin with, and the agora took up so much room that the third and fourth rows numbered the least ships. The camp with its ships and huts was like a city cut by many streets and alleys, but the main thoroughfares ran lengthwise through all 4 rows. From the land to the sea were crossroads, which separated the ships of the various nations. The ships in turn were divided off from the huts of their crews by narrower spaces, and every nation was subdivided into several parts, according to cities or leaders. The huts were made of wood and earth and covered with reeds. Every leader had his quarter in the foremost row of his men, and every one of these lodgings was more or less elaborate according to the rank of its owner. The ships served to protect the camp as a whole, but in front of this bulwark of the fleet the Argives had heaped earth, which made way for a true wall with towers only during the last period of the siege. In front of this barricade of earth was a trench, and within it a close-set palisade. The king and the council of Troy had taken so long to confer on the best means of defense that the Argives had ample opportunity to set up their camps in so careful a fashion, and to complete all their arrangements. Each of the warriors had also to tend the ships. Bread was apportioned to everyone at public stations. For all other matters necessary for life, each was responsible for himself. The common soldiers had light weapons and fought on foot. Those of higher rank fought with chariots, and every one of these fighters had their own charioteer. The use of cavalry in war was unknown to the people at that time. The chariots of the greatest among the heroes were intended for the front row and always had to be the vanguard. In the region between the Argive fleet and the city of Troy, the rivers Scamander and Simwa, which joined near the camp of the Danai, enclosed the flowering meadows of the Scamander and the plains of Troy. The space was so large that it took 4 hours to cross it on foot. It was admirably suited for a battlefield. Behind it rose the stately city of Troy, with its high ramparts and walls and towers built by the hands of gods. It was situated on a height and could be seen from far off. Within the city was hilly and cut by many thoroughfares. It was accessible, and even then only half the Dardanian gates, both with towers. The other sides were on such uneven ground, and the undergrowth was so thick and tangled that it enter through the gates and smaller entrances could not even be considered. In the upper city, or Acropolis, were the palaces of Priam and Paris, the temples of Hecate, Athene, and Apollo, and on the loftiest point, the temple of Zeus. In front of the city, near the river Simwa, and to the left of the Argives, was the hill Calicoluni to the right, and the road by the springs of the Scamander, and then past the hill called Baetia, which lay outside the town and could be circumvented. Behind Troy was the field of Ilium, which sloped gently upward and formed the lowest level of the wooded range of Ida, whose highest peak was Gargaron, and whose topmost ridges to the right and left of the Argives constituted the promontories of Sigium and Rhoetum. Now, before the battle between Danai and the Trojans began, the Danai were privileged to receive an honored guest. King Telephus of Mysia, who had given them such generous aid, had been suffering from the wound dealt by Achilles' spear, and the poultices prescribed by Podalirius and Machaon had long since ceased to be effective. In the throes of unbearable pain, he had consulted an oracle of Phoebus Apollo, which was in the country, and received the answer that only the spear which had given him the wound could heal it. Though he was unable to fathom the meaning of these strange words, he had himself carried on a ship and followed the Argive fleet. When he reached the mouth of the Scamander, he ordered his men to take him to the house of Achilles. The moment the young hero saw the king and his own pain at what he had done woke him afresh. Sadly, he took up his spear and laid it at the foot of the king's bed. He did not know in what way it could serve to heal the festering wound. A number of the heroes surrounded the king, and all were helpless in this matter, until Odysseus thought of again consulting the 2 famed physicians who traveled with the host. Podalirius and Machaon obeyed the summons, and the instant they heard the oracle of Apollo, these wise and experienced sons of Asclepius understood what it meant. They filed a little of the rust from the spear of Achilles and spread it over the wound. And then all saw a miracle. As soon as the filings touched the swollen, infected wound, it began to close before the very eyes of the heroes, and in a few hours, King Telephus was healed with the help of the spear which had pierced him, just as the oracle had predicted. Sound and joyful, he boarded his ship and left his hosts as they had but recently left him, with gratitude and blessings. But he hastened back to his own country, since he did not wish to witness the forthcoming struggle between the guest he had cherished and the Trojan kinsman he loved. And here is where we end our tale for today. But I'll be back with more tales, many more tales. Until then, my friends, enjoy the journey.